What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. How the Union Army commander died broke since his passing. Ulysses S. Grant has been one of the most revered and controversial figures in the history of American politics. He led the Union Army to victory against Confederate secession during the Civil War. He brokered peace between the divided fractions of the United States, and he was swept into the Oval Office on a wave of popularity after Andrew Johnson's impeachment. During his time in office, Grant accomplished a great deal with regards to civil rights and Reconstruction, however. His presidency was also rife with financial scandals that were committed by exploiting his well-known lack of business acumen and his ineptitude with money, finance, and investments. Despite his reputation as Civil War general and president, it was his trust in others and lack of financial skills that proved to be his downfall. After leaving office, Grant was hustled by a smooth-talking con man who ended up leaving the beloved politician in financial ruin shortly before he passed. However, it was this awful setback that put him on a path to writing his best-selling memoirs and ensuring financial safety for his family, but not before he passed nearly penniless. Grant desired to rise through the ranks of the wealthy. Throughout his presidency, Grant had befriended and taken economic advice from a number of wealthy industrialists and business tycoons, some of whom used that friendship to manipulate Grant without his knowledge. However, Grant had aspirations of becoming a well-known investor and joining the circles of wealthy friends he had made while in office after he left office and was approaching his 60th birthday. With a long list of wealthy friends and admirers, including banking mogul J.P. Morgan, Grant hoped he would be able to use his experience and connections to secure a healthy income in different ventures and establish his fortune. Sadly, Grant simply lacked financial expertise, as he had repeatedly demonstrated during his time in office and with his failed business prior to the outbreak of combat. His ambitious desire to experiment with investing became even more disastrous as a result of this. He went broke traveling the world to promote the United States. After leaving the White House, Grant decided to take his wife Julia on a 2-year world tour, traveling abroad on a trip funded, in part, by the returns on a $25,000 investment he'd made in a mining company. The tour took the couple across all of Europe, parts of the Middle East, Africa, and India, and Grant became the first U.S. president to ever visit Jerusalem. Grant, however, miscalculated how much the trip would cost, and despite President Rutherford B. Hayes allowing the pair to use federal transportation on U.S. Navy ships several times, they ran out of money and were forced to borrow a great deal from their son, Ulysses Buck Grant Jr., to complete their journey and return home. Grant invested $100,000 in Ferdinand Ward's Ponzi scheme. Grant's son, Buck, had teamed up with a financial whiz kid named Ferdinand Ward, who was referred to as the young Napoleon of Wall Street and was one of the fastest up-and-comers in the banking world at the time. Together, Ward and Grant Jr. formed Grant and Ward Company, and it was an extremely attractive opportunity for the former president. Borrowing $50,000 from an old buddy and another $50,000 from his wife and younger son, Grant invested a total of $100,000 in Grant and Ward Company, becoming an equal partner and thus lending his esteemed credibility to the firm. Little did he, or his son, know that Ward was running the company as a Ponzi scheme. By taking on Grant as a partner, Ward made his banking business appear more legitimate. After Grant's world tour, and in his role as the man who won the Civil War, he'd become something of a hero in the eyes of many Americans after leaving office, and was held in high esteem by those in every circle of society. This proved to be a lucrative opportunity for Ward and the company's additional partner, James D. Fish, who were the real masterminds behind the secret aims of the firm. According to an editorial written by Ward in 1909, Mr. Fish insisted that if the general came in with us, it would be the best thing in the world for us. While the general was not experienced and must perforce be a silent partner, Mr. Fish argued that using his name would be extremely beneficial to us. Often when we needed money quickly, the general could get it in the street when it would have been impossible for any of the rest of us to get it. Not only did they use Grant for his connections, but they used his involvement to legitimize and advertise their business and bring in new clients and investors by leveraging his reputation without his knowledge. The former president had a history of bad financial choices. Investing in Grant and Ward Company was far from the former president's only terrible business decision. He'd seen financial failure and ruin numerous times in the past as a result of his own ineptitude at investing as well as his gullibility and enduring trust in his fellow man. Long before his wartime triumphs, Grant and his wife struggled to keep a roof over their heads. He failed as a farmer and made several questionable business decisions that added to their hardship. After his presidency, Grant's fortunes didn't change. While he was a partner in Grant and Ward Company, he made a number of investments in property that proved to be financial failures and invested in a railroad in Mexico that ultimately failed. Ward wrote about one such incident in his 1909 essay on Grant's life. General John B. Gordon, the famous Confederate leader, came to New York to put this property on the market. He knew General Grant. He knew of his generosity and innocence of business ability and came directly to him. A strict investigation by any prospective purchaser would have quickly revealed the company to be carrying a load of debt. General Grant saw in General Gordon a one-time foeman, impoverished by a conflict the outcome of which General Grant had influenced more than any other man. He at once, without investigation on his own account, insisted that Grant and Ward buy the property. Ultimately, Gordon had lied about how much debt the property owed and how much the land itself was worth, leading to a $150,000 loss for Grant and Ward Company. When he learned of his investment's potential failure, he asked for help from William H. Vanderbilt. Eventually, the house of cards that Ward had been building collapsed. Ward had been soliciting investments from Grant's circle of friends and admirers, then making risky investments that didn't pay off and covering up the losses with money given by other investors, all while taking a cut for himself and covering up the discrepancies by cooking the books. The scheme couldn't go on forever, and as a last-ditch effort to infuse his company with cash, Ward came to Grant and said that the Marine National Bank, which was run by James D. Fish and which many of Grant and Ward Company's finances were tied to, was about to go bankrupt unless it got $150,000 immediately. Playing on Grant's patriot concerns regarding America's prosperity, Ward convinced Grant that a national panic would follow if the Marine National Bank collapsed, and a worried Grant turned to his friend, famed businessman William H. Vanderbilt for the large sum. Vanderbilt, who was the wealthiest man in the United States, told Grant that, from everything he'd heard about Ward, he would never invest in the company on its own merit. However, Vanderbilt was so committed to his friendship with Grant that he lent him the money as a personal favor, and likely knew he would never see it returned. Grant lost everything he invested, including the $150,000 given to him by Vanderbilt. With a $150,000 loan from Vanderbilt in hand, Grant turned the money over to Ward with the assurance that the cash infusion would avert a national financial crisis and keep the company afloat. However, when Grant arrived at the office the next day, he found his distraught son, who told him that both the Marine National Bank and Grant and Ward Company were officially bankrupt and Ward had fled with all of their money and savings. Grant realized he had a $150,000 debt hanging over him after his son and he were clean. "I have made it a rule of my life to trust a man long after other people have given up on him." Depressed at his financial ruin and having been betrayed by Ward, whom Grant had become close friends with over their 3 years working together, the former president famously told the company's bookkeeper, "I don't see how I can trust any human being ever again." When the public learned of his financial loss, many donated money to support him. The widespread love and support of Grant became apparent after news of his financial misfortune broke. Many saw him as a man who lovingly dedicated his time and money to a venture in an effort to support his son, and was victimized by a heartless con man who scammed not only Grant but several other public figures as well, including famed political cartoonist Thomas Nast. It wasn't long before people, many of whom were former soldiers who appreciated Grant's service to the nation, began donating their own money to help the beloved politician rebound from bankruptcy. People began mailing Grant checks, and with only a few $100s to his name, he had no choice but to accept their generosity. One of the many checks included a note that read, "On account of my share for services ending in April 1865, referring to a debt the check writer believed he owed Grant for his efforts towards defeating the Confederacy." Though Vanderbilt offered to forgive his loans, Grant refused. Before the Former Presidents Act of 1958 established a pension for former presidents, the federal government provided no financial security or retirement benefits to those who held the highest office in the land, including Grant. Therefore, Grant was nearly entirely destitute after the collapse of Grant and Ward Company and had no financial security in sight. Grant steadfastly refused Vanderbilt's offer to forgive the debt and decided to sell the family's home to repay him. Vanderbilt agreed to take over the deed to Grant's home but allowed the family to continue living there. Additionally, Grant gave Vanderbilt nearly all of the mementos he'd collected in his life, including his medals, his military uniform, and various items he'd acquired during his world tour. Reluctantly, Vanderbilt accepted the historically valuable mementos and insisted that the debt had been paid in full. Vanderbilt later donated the entire collection to the Smithsonian Institution. Only 4 months after the scandal, Grant was diagnosed with throat cancer. While questions remain regarding Grant's love for liquor, with some suggesting that he was a rampant alcoholic and others claiming that rumors of his drunkenness were spread by his detractors, there was no question at all about his appreciation for smoking cigars. According to Ward's recollections of his time with Grant, in an essay published in 1909, the former con man recalled that Grant smoked incessantly. "I have known him to go to bed with a heavy Havana in his mouth, put out the lights and continue smoking for a time in the dark. The first thing he did when he awakened was to get this stub and light it. Sometimes he would smoke another whole cigar before breakfast. Luncheon and dinner usually interrupted his smoking, and he would put his half-finished cigar aside, to be resumed immediately upon finishing his meal. When he came to the office, I always had 25 of his favorite 3 for 50-cent cigars ready for him, and invariably he smoked them all during the day." In the summer of 1884, Grant went bankrupt and began complaining of a sore throat at the base of his tongue. He didn't see a doctor until October. When he finally did, he was diagnosed with terminal throat cancer. In his final year, Grant wrote his memoirs. Upon discovery that he was at the end, Grant became determined not to leave his family penniless and set out to write his memoirs in the hopes of making some money for his wife and children in their later years. Upon his doctor's orders, Grant moved out to a cabin in the Adirondacks so that he could breathe clean mountain air and cut back his smoking to only 3 cigars a day. Grant worked tirelessly on his memoirs, knowing his time was limited and his health was quickly declining. He wrote pages upon pages every day while losing his voice and becoming unable to eat. When he became too weak to write, he'd dictate his book until it was finished. Many doctors at the time believed it was his iron will and steadfast determination to complete the manuscript that kept him alive for the months it took to write it. Mark Twain published his memoirs to widespread acclaim. Grant had long been friends with acclaimed novelist and journalist Mark Twain, and Twain had been encouraging and even pushing the former president to write his memoirs for nearly a decade before his cancer diagnosis, even offering to publish Grant's book. However, Grant almost signed a disastrous contract with another publishing company that would have only given him 10% of royalties and little to no advance. Twain called the offer appalling, but Grant said that he was honor-bound to agree to it since they were the first to offer to publish his work. Not wanting to see his friend make yet another ruinous business decision, Twain convinced Grant to change his mind by pointing out that he'd offered to publish the memoirs years before, and Grant reluctantly conceded the point. Taking a $1,000 advance to cover living expenses, Grant got to work writing and kept at it until he'd finished his 2-volume memoirs. Grant passed on July 23, 1885, at age 63, and his book was published in December. It went on to become one of the best-selling memoirs ever at the time, earning Grant's wife $450,000, the equivalent of nearly $10 million today. The Personal Memoirs of Ulysses S. Many historians still consider Grant to be one of the best historical memoirs ever written. Grant's funeral set a new record. When Grant passed, the country mourned. His funeral procession through the streets of New York City was one of the longest in history, with over 60,000 former and current members of the military following behind his casket, trailing in a line stretching 7 miles. Generals who'd fought on the side of both the Union and the Confederacy served as pallbearers at his funeral, as Grant was highly respected and appreciated for his compassion toward the Confederate Army when they finally surrendered at Appomattox 2 decades earlier. His funeral was attended by over 1.5 million people in total. President Grover Cleveland directed the nation to observe a 35-day mourning period in honor of his passing, before being reinterred in the General Grant National Memorial, also known as Grant's Tomb, a decade later, which is still the largest mausoleum in North America. Grant was buried in Riverside Park in a temporary location. The monument to his memory was paid for almost entirely from donations from the public and by contributions from private companies looking to honor the late general. Shortly after the scandal, Ward was caught, and he served 6 years in prison. Ferdinand Ward didn't manage to get away scot-free, as he was caught soon after the collapse of Grant and Ward Company. He was, as he proudly recounted in later years, the best-hated man in America, as he not only caused a scandalous banking collapse that cost many people millions of dollars, but because the general public believed he was indirectly responsible for Grant's eventual end, due to the stress and heartbreak of the scandal and betrayal. Ward was found guilty of grand larceny and given a 10-year prison sentence at Sing Sing. There, he is said to have used the same tricks that helped him con so many wealthy investors into making friends with other inmates and guards. He manipulated his wife into selling her jewelry to fund his comparatively lavish life behind bars, and he was eventually released from prison after 6.5 years for good behavior. He largely remained a social pariah, however, and faced legal troubles for the remainder of his life. Ward passed away in 1926, aged 74. Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general who became president, was one of the most well-known figures in American history. He was a man who represented the paradoxes of national greatness and personal failure. Victorious at Appomattox, beloved across the Union, and carried into the White House by waves of patriotic admiration, Grant seemed destined for greatness not just on the battlefield but in every arena of life. Yet for all his martial prowess and political achievements, he harbored a fatal flaw that would come to define the final chapter of his life: a tragic and unshakable naivety in matters of money. Grant's post-presidential years were marred by a steady descent into financial ruin, despite his celebrated military victories and 2 terms in office. He died nearly penniless, betrayed by those he trusted most, and hounded by the same optimistic misjudgments that had shadowed his earlier attempts at civilian success. Grant's downfall wasn't sudden. It was a slow, painful erosion born from misplaced trust, a lack of business acumen, and a deeply ingrained belief that the honor and integrity he so valued in himself existed in others as well. His financial ruin would come not on a battlefield but in the cold, indifferent world of Wall Street finance, where men with silver tongues and hidden ledgers saw in the former president not a partner, but a pawn. After serving 2 terms as president, Grant chose not to run for a third and instead embarked on a grand world tour with his wife Julia, a decision motivated in part by a desire to celebrate his legacy and forge international relationships. The trip, originally meant as a symbolic gesture of goodwill, became a costly extravagance that spiraled far beyond his calculations. Funded partly by the returns of a $25,000 mining investment and supplemented by borrowed funds from his son Buck, the Grants traversed Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, even becoming the first American presidential couple to visit Jerusalem. The reception Grant received around the world was adoring. He was treated as a hero, a conquering general, and a global statesman. Yet the expenses quickly ballooned. Despite occasional assistance from the U.S. Navy for transportation, Grant returned home burdened with debts and financially unsteady. Still, Grant believed that he could stabilize his finances by stepping into the booming world of post-war investment and banking. He had always admired the wealth of the industrial elite he had mingled with during his presidency, men like J.P. He hoped to join Morgan and Jay Gould's ranks not through war or politics but through business. He yearned to leave his children a financial legacy worthy of his name. But Grant's entire life had proven that while he was a genius in matters of strategy and leadership, he lacked even a rudimentary understanding of economics or business. He had failed as a farmer, failed as a businessman, and now, tragically, he would fail again. The most catastrophic chapter of Grant's financial collapse began with the formation of the firm Grant and Ward Company, a partnership between his son Ulysses "Buck" Grant Jr. and a young, charismatic financier named Ferdinand Ward. Known as the young Napoleon of Wall Street, Ward had rapidly gained fame for generating staggering returns on investments. Buck was dazzled by Ward's bravado, and with his father's blessing, the trio formed a financial firm that quickly attracted investors. Grant lent his name to the business and invested $100,000, which included $50,000 from his wife and younger son, $50,000 from a friend, and Grant's trademark optimism. His involvement immediately lent the firm an aura of respectability and trustworthiness. Unbeknownst to Grant, that was precisely what Ward had intended. Behind the curtain, Ward was running a textbook Ponzi scheme. He and his associate, James D. Fish, used the Grant name to attract wealthy investors, then used the funds to make risky plays and pay off earlier investors, all while embezzling large sums for themselves. According to Ward's later writings, Fish had emphasized that having the general as a silent partner was not merely desirable, it was essential. "If the general came in with us," Fish reportedly said, "it would be the best thing in the world for us." And so, Grant became the smiling face of a fraudulent empire, blissfully unaware of the house of cards being constructed behind him. Grant had a poor track record when it came to making financial decisions. Before the Civil War he had tried, and failed, at farming, selling firewood, and other small enterprises. His trusting nature and refusal to scrutinize the intentions of others consistently left him vulnerable. Even after his presidency, he continued to make poor investment choices, such as putting money into a Mexican railroad project that collapsed and purchasing debt-laden property from former Confederate General John B. Gordon, who exploited Grant's guilt over Southern poverty and his belief in reconciliation. That one decision alone cost the Grant and Ward firm $150,000. Grant remained optimistic nonetheless. He thought the company's success would continue to grow, and Ward was a genius. Grant panicked when Ward pleaded for an infusion of $150,000 to prevent a nationwide panic and warned that the Marine National Bank, which was closely linked to their operations, was on the verge of collapse. Thinking the entire economy might collapse without his help, he approached his friend William H. Vanderbilt, who secured a personal loan and was the heir to the Vanderbilt Railroad empire.